Dear Dad, you'd have called it crazy. A civilian teaching us how to fly better than the manuals, showing career military pilots that everything we'd been taught about engines was wrong, or at least incomplete. But Charles Lindbergh did the impossible. He made the P-38 drink fuel like a priest sips wine, stretched our range by hundreds of miles, turned what should have been suicide missions into survivable operations. I watched him do it, Dad. Watched this legend from before my time climb into a lightning and prove that sometimes the most important battles aren't won with guns, but with knowledge, patience, and the kind of understanding that comes from truly listening to what an engine is trying to tell you. You would have loved him, Dad. He speaks the same language you do, the language of pistons and manifold pressure and respect for the machines that keep us alive. I'm writing this from Dobadura in New Guinea, sitting in the shade of my P-38's port engine nacelle while the ground crew performs post-flight maintenance. My Lightning, I call her Silver Promise after that old biplane you rebuilt when I was 10. She's got bullet holes in the vertical stabilizer from today's mission and a hydraulic leak that needs attention. But she brought me home again despite flying further than any P-38 should be able to fly on a single tank of fuel. That's Lindbergh's gift to us, Dad. Not just extra range, but the confidence that comes from knowing your aircraft can make it home, that you're not going to run out of fuel 50 miles from base and have to ditch in the ocean, where your chances of rescue are maybe 1 in 10 if you're lucky. The technique sounds insane when you first hear it, goes against everything they taught us in flight school. Reduce RPM to 1600. 1600, Dad, when standard operating procedure says 2400 for cruise. Increase manifold pressure to 30 inches of mercury when the manual says that'll blow your engines in an hour. Run auto-lean fuel mixture when conventional wisdom says you need auto-rich to keep the engines from overheating. It's backwards, upside down, completely contrary to accepted doctrine. And it works, Dad. It works so well that it's changing how we fight this war, allowing missions that were impossible 3 months ago, bringing pilots home who would have died when their fuel ran out over enemy territory. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment if someone in your family ever built, fixed, or flew something that made a difference. Every story keeps their legacy in motion. Because what Lindbergh did here matters beyond just one theater of one war. It proves that innovation can come from unexpected places, that civilians have contributions to make even in military operations, that the best ideas don't always come through official channels or from people in uniform. My name is Robert L. A lieutenant junior grade in the United States Army Air Force's 475th Fighter Group. They call us Satan's Angels, which sounds more intimidating than we actually are, just pilots doing a job in conditions that range from difficult to impossible. I'm 26 years old, from Spokane, Washington, and before the war I was a flight instructor and aircraft mechanic. Skills I learned from you in that drafty hangar where we spent every weekend for years rebuilding old planes and teaching rich men's sons how to keep their expensive toys in the air. You remember that hangar, Dad? Of course you remember it. You built half of it yourself. Corrugated metal walls and a concrete floor you poured one summer when I was maybe 8 years old, too young to help much but old enough to hand you tools and watch you work and slowly absorb the lessons you were teaching without words. That hangar was more home to me than our actual house sometimes, more comfortable, more honest. Houses have to maintain appearances, have to hide their problems behind fresh paint and closed doors. But hangars are what they are, spaces for work, for honest labor, for the kind of problems that can be solved with wrenches and knowledge and patience. Winter of 1938. That's the memory I keep coming back to out here in the Pacific heat and humidity. I was 17, just starting to think about college, or maybe military service. Hadn't yet decided what I wanted to do with my life beyond flying and fixing planes. We were working on that Stearman that Johnson had crashed. Not badly, just hard enough to bend the landing gear and crack the engine mount. And it was cold enough that our breath fogged in the air and the metal was painful to touch with bare hands. You had Glenn Miller playing on that beat-up radio, and you were hammering on the engine block, trying to true up a warped mounting surface, and I was handing you tools and learning. The smell, Dad. I can still smell it. Motor oil and metal shavings, that particular scent of aluminum when it's being filed or machined. coffee gone cold in enamel cups, the sharp, clean smell of winter air mixing with the warmth from the kerosene heater we kept burning in the corner. The taste of that air, metallic and cold, dust and iron settling on your tongue. The sound of your hammer striking metal in a steady rhythm, the crackle of Glenn Miller's orchestra from the radio, the distant whistle of wind through gaps in the metal walls, and the light, Dad. I'll never forget the light. Winter sun coming through those high windows, cutting through the rafters in distinct beams, dust motes floating in those shafts of gold, steam rising from the engine block when you poured hot water over it to check for leaks. You were bent over that Stearman's radial engine, grease on your hands and your face, wearing that ancient leather jacket you'd had since the Great War, and you said something I didn't fully understand at the time, but that stayed with me through years of flying and fighting and trying to keep aircraft operational under conditions you never had to face. "Listen to the motor breathe, son," you said, not looking up from your work, hands still moving as you spoke. Every engine's got its own voice, its own rhythm. You learn to hear that rhythm, you'll know what it needs before it breaks. Most pilots, they just fly. But the good ones, the ones who survive, they listen. They understand that an aircraft isn't just a machine you control. It's a partner you work with, and partners need to communicate. I thought I understood what you meant, Dad. Thought I'd learned that lesson through hundreds of hours of flight instruction and maintenance work, through the crashes I'd helped repair and the engines I'd helped rebuild. But I didn't really understand, not fully, not until Charles Lindbergh showed up in New Guinea and demonstrated what listening to an engine really means, what's possible when you truly understand the machine instead of just following the manual. Lindbergh showed up at Dobadura in June of '44, this famous civilian who'd flown the Atlantic solo back in '27, when aviation was still new and dangerous, and every flight was an adventure that might end in death. We'd all heard of him, of course. Lucky Lindy, the newspapers had called him, though anyone who understood aviation knew luck had nothing to do with it. He'd planned that Atlantic crossing with obsessive attention to detail, had worked with the engineers at Ryan Aircraft to design a plane specifically for that mission, had calculated fuel consumption and weight and range with mathematical precision. Luck might have kept the weather from killing him, but skill and preparation got him from New York to Paris. But that was 17 years ago, ancient history by 1944 standards, and none of us knew what to make of a civilian consultant showing up at a combat airbase in the Southwest Pacific. We were wary, skeptical, maybe a little resentful that someone from outside the military thought he could teach us our jobs. We'd been flying P-38 Lightnings for months, had combat experience, had learned through trial and error what worked and what didn't. What could a civilian, even a famous one, possibly teach us that we didn't already know? The answer, it turned out, was everything that mattered most. The P-38 Lightning is a magnificent aircraft, Dad. You'd love it. Twin-engine, twin-boom design, tricycle landing gear, pressurized cockpit, and armament that could tear apart anything the Japanese put in the air. 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose so there's no convergence issues, no need to adjust for different trajectories from wing-mounted guns. When you fire the Lightning's guns, everything goes exactly where you're aiming. It's fast, over 400 miles per hour in level flight, and it climbs like a homesick angel, and it's got range that no single-engine fighter can match. But that range was killing us, Dad. Not literally killing us, though it did that too sometimes, but limiting us, constraining our operations, making missions we needed to fly impossible because the fuel consumption was too high. The Allison V1710 engines in the P-38, they're powerful and reliable, but they drink fuel like a drunk sailor on shore leave, especially at the RPM settings the technical manuals specified. 2400 RPM for cruise, auto-rich fuel mixture, manifold pressure kept below 28 inches of mercury to prevent detonation and engine damage. That's what the manuals said, that's what we'd been taught, and that's what was giving us maybe a 3-hour combat radius at best. 3 hours isn't enough in the Pacific, Dad. The distances are too vast, the targets too far from our bases, the ocean too big and empty and deadly if you have to ditch because you ran out of fuel before you made it home. We were losing pilots not to enemy action, but to fuel exhaustion, good men ditching in the ocean and either drowning or dying of exposure before rescue could reach them, if rescue could reach them at all. And we couldn't extend our range by carrying more fuel because the P-38 was already operating at maximum weight, couldn't add tanks without compromising performance, couldn't fly lower and slower because that made us vulnerable to Japanese fighters who had altitude and speed advantages. So when Lindbergh arrived and said he could solve our fuel problem, we listened, not because we believed him, but because we were desperate enough to try anything that might bring our boys home alive. Lindbergh didn't start with theory or equations or long explanations of thermodynamics and engine efficiency. He started by asking to fly, said he needed to understand the problem personally before he could solve it. Captain H.D., our squadron commander, he was skeptical, called Lindbergh the ghost mechanic behind his back, wondered what a civilian could possibly learn in a few flights that we hadn't learned in months of combat operations. But he authorized the flights, maybe because Lindbergh was famous, maybe because headquarters had made it clear this civilian consultant had authority to do whatever he wanted, or maybe just because we'd already lost 3 pilots to fuel exhaustion that month and anything was worth trying. So Lindbergh flew. Not 1 mission, not 2, but dozens. He flew escort missions, flew fighter sweeps, flew reconnaissance, flew everything we flew, and took notes constantly, filled entire notebooks with observations about fuel consumption and engine performance and manifold pressure at different altitudes and airspeeds. He flew with different pilots, asked questions, listened to our complaints about range and fuel and the constant anxiety of watching the gauge drop while you're still hours from home, and then he started experimenting. The first time he explained his technique, we thought he was crazy. We were at a briefing, maybe 20 pilots, all of us veterans with combat experience. And Lindbergh stood at the front of the operations tent with a chalkboard covered in calculations and diagrams. "The manual is wrong," he said. Simple as that. No preamble or apology. "The settings they're telling you to use aren't optimal for fuel efficiency. You can cut your consumption by 30%, maybe more, by running lower RPM and higher manifold pressure than doctrine allows." Lieutenant Tex M., he spoke up first. Tex was from Texas, naturally, had maybe 50 combat missions under his belt, wasn't about to let some civilian tell him his business. "Mr. Lindbergh, sir," Tex said, polite but firm, "we've been taught that high manifold pressure with low RPM will destroy the engines, cause detonation, maybe blow a cylinder. The manual specifically warns against over-square operation. The manual is based on test data from engines run at sea level in ideal conditions," Lindbergh replied. "Up at altitude, in the thin air where you're actually operating, the conditions are completely different. The risk of detonation decreases with altitude because the air is less dense, less oxygen per cubic inch, less possibility of the uncontrolled combustion that causes detonation. What's dangerous at sea level becomes safe at 20,000 feet. He walked us through the math, Dad, showed us the calculations for brake mean effective pressure and fuel-air ratios and thermal efficiency. Most of it went over my head. I'm a mechanic's son, not an engineer. But the basic principle made sense. By reducing RPM, you reduce friction losses and parasitic drag from the propellers. By increasing manifold pressure, you maintain power output. By running auto-lean mixture, you optimize combustion efficiency. The combination results in the same speed and performance, but with dramatically lower fuel consumption. I've tested it," Lindbergh said. "Flown multiple missions using these settings. The engines run cooler, not hotter. Fuel consumption drops by 25 to 30%. Your range increases by the same proportion. Missions that are currently impossible become possible." We didn't believe him. Or rather, we wanted to believe him, but couldn't quite accept that something this important, this fundamental, could have been wrong in all our training and all our technical manuals. But Lindbergh didn't need us to believe him. He just needed us to try it. My first flight using Lindbergh's technique was a morning escort mission in early July, taking bombers to hit Japanese positions near Wewak. It was supposed to be a 4-hour round trip, long enough that we'd normally land with maybe 20 minutes of fuel remaining, enough to make you sweat, but not enough to make you panic. I took off with my flight of 4 P-38s, climbed to 22,000 feet, and once we were at cruise altitude, I did something that felt completely wrong, completely contrary to every instinct I'd developed through hundreds of hours of flying. I pulled the RPM back to 1600. Reduced it from the normal 2400 to a level so low it felt like the engines were barely running, felt like I was gliding instead of flying under power. The sound changed immediately, Dad. The roar of the Allison engines dropped to a purr, almost quiet. The vibration in the airframe reduced to nearly nothing. It felt wrong. Felt like the aircraft was about to stall or fall out of the sky. Felt like I'd made a terrible mistake and was about to kill myself and my wingman through stupid experimentation. But the airspeed held. The altitude held. And when I checked the fuel flow gauge, the needles had dropped by almost a third. We were burning significantly less fuel at the same speed and altitude, exactly like Lindbergh had promised. Then I increased manifold pressure to 30 inches, pushed it higher than I'd ever run it before, higher than the manual said was safe, watched the gauge climb past the red line that marked the supposed danger zone. And nothing bad happened. The engines didn't detonate, didn't overheat, didn't miss a beat. They just kept running, smooth and steady and efficient, burning less fuel and producing the same power and proving that everything I thought I knew about engine management had been incomplete at best, wrong at worst. I flew the whole mission at Lindbergh's settings, Dad. Flew to the target, engaged Japanese fighters that came up to intercept the bombers, flew back to base, and when I landed I still had 45 minutes of fuel remaining instead of the usual 20. 45 minutes, Dad. That's the difference between life and death in the Pacific, between making it home and ditching in the ocean, between a pilot who survives the war and a pilot whose wife gets a telegram saying he's missing in action. After landing, I just sat in the cockpit for a while, engine shut down, trying to process what had just happened. Everything I'd been taught was wrong. Not maliciously wrong, not wrong because someone was trying to hurt us, but wrong because the people who wrote the manuals had incomplete information, had made assumptions based on sea-level testing that didn't apply at altitude. And it took a civilian, someone outside the military system, someone who hadn't been indoctrinated into accepting official doctrine without question, to see what we'd all missed. You would have understood immediately, Dad. You always said that engines tell you what they need if you learn their language, that manuals are written by people who don't fly the aircraft or maintain them in the field, that real knowledge comes from paying attention to the machine instead of blindly following instructions. Lindbergh understood that too. Understood it so deeply that he could look at our fuel consumption problems and see not just what was wrong, but how to fix it. Could take his decades of aviation experience and apply them to a military problem that military pilots hadn't been able to solve. The real test came in August, a mission that would have been impossible before Lindbergh's technique, that demonstrated just how much he'd changed what we could do with the P-38. We got orders to escort B-24 Liberators on a strike against Japanese shipping near the Philippines. Not the northern Philippines, where we had bases nearby, but the southern islands, over 600 miles from Dobodura. 600 miles each way, 1,200 miles total, plus combat time over the target, plus reserves for bad weather or navigation errors or any of the 1,000 things that can go wrong on a long-range mission. The mission planners had calculated fuel consumption using standard settings and determined the mission was impossible, that we'd run out of fuel somewhere over the ocean on the return leg, that sending P-38s on this escort would be suicide. But Captain H.D. had been using Lindbergh's technique on his own flights, had proven it worked, had become a believer. He asked permission to try the mission using the new fuel management protocol, argued that we could make it if we used proper technique, convinced headquarters to let us try. So we launched at dawn, 8 P-38s, my flight plus one other, all of us briefed on the importance of precise fuel management and the consequences of screwing it up. Took off, formed up, climbed to altitude and set our engines to Lindbergh's settings. 1600 RPM, 30 inches manifold pressure, auto-lean mixture. And we flew, Dad, Flew out over the Pacific toward the Philippines with the fuel gauges dropping slower than they'd ever dropped before, with confidence instead of anxiety, with the knowledge that we were going to make it there and back because a civilian had taught us how to listen to our engines. The flight to the target took 3 hours, 3 hours of steady cruise over ocean so blue and empty it hurt to look at, so vast that if you went down you'd never be found, would just disappear into that immensity and be one more missing pilot whose family would spend the rest of their lives wondering what happened. But we didn't go down. We flew steady and smooth, engines purring instead of roaring, fuel consumption exactly where Lindbergh's calculations predicted. Met the bombers at the rendezvous point, took up position above and behind them, scanned the sky for Japanese fighters that we knew would come because they always came when bombers approached. And come they did. Maybe a dozen Ki-43 Oscars and Ki-61 Tonys diving out of the sun in a coordinated attack trying to break through our screen and get at the bombers. We engaged, Dad, turned into them, and used the P-38's superior speed and firepower to break up their formation, got 2 confirmed kills, and damaged several others. Drove them off before they could reach the bombers. The combat lasted maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes of violent maneuvering that burned fuel faster than cruise, that involved full throttle and maximum power, and all the things that should have emptied our tanks. But when it was over and we reformed on the bombers for the flight home, I checked my gauges and saw we still had plenty of fuel, more than enough for the return flight, no anxiety or fear that we'd end up ditching in the ocean. We made it home, Dad. All 8 P-38s, all 16 pilots, landed back at Dobodura with fuel to spare, proved that a mission the planners had called impossible was not only possible but survivable. And the bombers made it too, completed their strike and came home safe because we'd been able to escort them the entire way, because Lindbergh had given us the range to protect them. After landing, I found Lindbergh on the flight line. He'd been flying his own missions that day, still gathering data, still refining his technique. It worked, I told him. Unnecessary statement because he knew it would work. But I needed to say it anyway, needed to acknowledge what he'd done. We flew 1,200 miles and fought and came home with fuel to spare. You saved our lives today. He just nodded, gave me that slight smile of his, said something I'll never forget. I didn't save your lives, Lieutenant. I just helped you understand your aircraft better. The P-38 was always capable of this range. You just needed to know how to ask it for what you needed instead of demanding what you wanted. But Dad, I need to tell you about why Lindbergh's technique matters so much, why it's not just about fuel efficiency or range extension, but about lives that could have been saved, pilots who would still be alive if we'd known sooner. I need to tell you about Lieutenant James K., one of our best pilots, a kid from California who'd been flying combat missions since early '43, who'd survived dozens of encounters with Japanese fighters and earned the respect of everyone in the squadron. James died in May, 2 weeks before Lindbergh arrived, died not from enemy action but from fuel exhaustion. He'd been escorting bombers on a mission that pushed the P-38's range to its limit, had encountered heavy Japanese resistance over the target, had burned extra fuel in combat, and then faced unexpected headwinds on the return flight. He made it to within 30 miles of base before his engines quit. Both of them, fuel tanks completely dry. He called it in, calm professional voice giving his position and saying he was going to ditch. And then we heard the impact and then silence. We searched for 3 days, Dad. Flew search patterns over the area where he'd gone down. Looked for a life raft or wreckage or any sign that he'd survived. Never found him. The ocean swallowed him like he'd never existed. Like all those hours of training and combat experience and skill meant nothing against the simple mathematics of fuel consumption and range. And the thing is, Dad, the thing that keeps me awake some nights, James would have made it home if he'd been using Lindbergh's technique. The 30% fuel savings would have given him the margin he needed, would have let him land with fuel to spare instead of ditching 30 miles short of the runway. He'd still be alive, would still be flying, would still be writing letters home to his parents telling them he was safe and thinking about them and looking forward to the day when the war ended and he could come home. His last words over the radio were, "Tell my wife I tried." That's what he said, that's his epitaph. 4 words that sum up the tragedy of dying not from enemy action, but from a technical limitation that didn't need to exist, from fuel consumption that could have been reduced if only we'd known what Lindbergh taught us too late to save James's life. I think about him every time I fly now, every time I set my engines to 1600 RPM and 30 inches manifold pressure and watch the fuel consumption drop. I think about how he died and why he died, and how his death was preventable, how he and others like him paid the price for our ignorance, for our blind adherence to technical manuals written by people who didn't understand the operational realities of Pacific combat. And I'm grateful for Lindbergh's contribution while simultaneously angry that it came so late, that men had to die before someone outside the military system could see what we'd all missed. That's war, Dad. That's the ugly truth beneath all the heroism and sacrifice and noble rhetoric. Men die needlessly sometimes, die because of mistakes or ignorance or bad luck, or the simple fact that knowledge takes time to spread and verify and implement. And all we can do is learn from those deaths, honor them by making sure future pilots don't die the same way, carry their memory forward, and let it inform how we fly and fight and survive. You taught me to listen to engines, Dad. Taught me that machines have voices if you know how to hear them. That the sound of a motor running can tell you everything you need to know about its health and performance. But I didn't really understand what you meant until Lindbergh showed us that listening means more than just hearing. It means questioning assumptions, testing alternatives, being willing to set aside what you've been taught if the evidence suggests a better way. The P-38s Allison engines were trying to tell us something all along, Dad. They were running hot and loud at 2400 RPM, consuming fuel faster than necessary, working harder than they needed to. But we didn't hear what they were saying because we were too busy following the manual, too committed to official doctrine, too afraid to experiment with settings that contradicted what we'd been taught. We were listening, but we weren't hearing, weren't understanding the message the machines were trying to send. Lindbergh heard it. Heard it because he approached the problem without preconceptions, without the baggage of military training and official procedures, without the fear of contradicting authority that makes so many pilots hesitant to deviate from standard practice. He listened to the engines and understood what they needed, trusted his own experience and knowledge more than he trusted the manual, had the confidence to prove his theory correct even when everyone else doubted. That's what true expertise looks like, Dad. Not blind obedience to instructions. Not memorization of procedures, but deep understanding of principles, ability to apply knowledge to new situations, willingness to question and test and refine. You had that expertise with aircraft maintenance, could diagnose problems by sound and feel and smell, could rebuild engines that other mechanics would have scrapped as beyond repair. Lindbergh had that expertise with aviation, had spent decades thinking about fuel efficiency and range and performance, had experience that transcended what any manual could teach. And now he's passed that knowledge to us, taught us not just his specific technique, but the broader lesson about listening to machines and questioning assumptions and never accepting that something is impossible just because it's never been done before. That lesson will outlive this war, will shape how I approach aviation for the rest of my life, will inform how I teach others, whether in civilian flight instruction or whatever comes after the war ends. I need to tell you about the men I fly with, Dad, the pilots who've become family over months of shared danger and shared triumph, who've learned Lindbergh's technique alongside me and proven that innovation spreads quickly when lives depend on it. These men are the finest aviators I've ever known, equal parts courage and skill, and I'm honored to call them friends. Lieutenant Tex M. The skeptic who became the loudest believer. Tex flies like he talks, aggressive and confident, pushing his P-38 to its limits, but always staying within the bounds of smart flying. After that first mission using Lindbergh's technique, Tex became an evangelist, teaching every new pilot who arrived at the squadron about proper fuel management, about listening to engines, about the difference between following the manual and understanding the aircraft. "That civilian saved my bacon," he'd say, grinning his Texas grin. "And if he could do it once, we can keep doing it. Just got to pay attention to what the airplane's telling us." Captain H.D., Our squadron commander, who called Lindbergh the ghost mechanic until he flew with him and understood, HD's older than most of us, maybe 35, was flying in the Air Corps before the war started. He's got the kind of experience that commands respect, the kind of judgment that keeps pilots alive. And when he endorsed Lindbergh's technique, it carried weight throughout the squadron. "I've been flying 20 years, he told us at one briefing, and I just learned something fundamental about engines that I should have known all along. That's humbling, but it's also exciting. Makes me wonder what else we don't know yet, what other improvements we haven't discovered." And then there's Crew Chief Ramos, the Filipino mechanic who maintains my P-38 and treats her like she's his daughter, who knows every rivet and wire and system in the aircraft and can diagnose problems before they become failures. Ramos was the first of the ground crew to understand what Lindbergh was doing, the first to see that the new settings actually reduced engine wear instead of increasing it, that the motors ran cooler and smoother and lasted longer. "That engine breathes easier now," he told me after my first flight with the new technique, using almost exactly the same words you'd used in that hangar back in Spokane, proving that mechanics speak a universal language regardless of where they come from or what uniform they wear. These men are my brothers now, Dad, bound together by shared experience and shared understanding, by the knowledge that we've learned something important and that we're using it to keep each other alive. We fly together, fight together, and when one of us doesn't come back because not all of us will make it home, that's just the mathematics of combat aviation. We carry his memory forward and let it inform how we fly and fight and honor his sacrifice. By September, the word has spread throughout the Pacific Theater, Dad. Lindbergh's technique has been tested and verified and officially adopted, no longer a civilian consultant's heresy, but standard operating procedure for P-38 operations. The fighter groups in the Philippines are using it. The units in the Solomon Islands are using it. Even the training commands back in the States are incorporating it into their curricula, so that new pilots arrive already understanding proper fuel management instead of having to unlearn what they'd been taught. It's a quiet revolution, Dad, the kind that doesn't make headlines or win medals, but that saves lives and changes how wars are fought. Nobody's going to write newspaper articles about fuel consumption optimization or give Lindbergh a Medal of Honor for teaching us to fly our aircraft more efficiently. But pilots know, and that's what matters. Every pilot who makes it home on a mission that would have been impossible 3 months ago, every bomber crew that completes their strike with full fighter escort instead of partial coverage, every Japanese target that gets hit because we can now range further than they thought possible. All of that traces back to a civilian consultant who understood engines better than the military experts, who had the courage to challenge accepted doctrine, who proved that innovation doesn't always come through official channels. The P-38 Lightning is now the dominant long-range fighter in the Pacific, Dad, not because the aircraft changed, but because we learned to use it properly. We can escort bombers to targets that used to be beyond our range, can fly fighter sweeps deep into enemy territory, can respond to threats and opportunities that were previously out of reach. And more importantly, more personally, pilots are surviving missions they would have died on before, making it home instead of ditching in the ocean, living to fly another day and write letters home and hope for the war's end. That's Lindbergh's legacy here, Dad. Not glory or fame or recognition, but saved lives and expanded capability, and the knowledge that sometimes the most important contributions come from unexpected sources, from people who aren't part of the system, but who see what the system has missed. He's still flying combat missions, still gathering data, still looking for other optimizations and improvements we haven't discovered yet. And we're flying with him, learning from him, applying his lessons to our daily operations. I keep your propeller pin with me on every flight, Dad. Keep it pinned to the inside of my flight jacket where I can touch it before takeoff and after landing, where it's close to my heart and reminds me where I came from and what you taught me. That pin is more than just a lucky charm or a sentimental keepsake. It's a symbol of everything you showed me about aviation, about engines, about listening and learning and never being satisfied with surface-level understanding. You gave me that pin the day I shipped out for flight training, handed it to me without ceremony or speech, just pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. but I understood what you were saying without words. That you were proud of me. That you believed in me. That everything you'd taught me in that hangar was now going to be tested in ways neither of us could predict. That pin has been with me through training and combat and close calls and victories, has survived missions where I barely survived, has become as much a part of my flying as my parachute or my oxygen mask. And now, after learning from Lindbergh, after understanding what you meant about listening to engines, that pin means even more. It represents not just your teaching, but the continuous learning that aviation requires, the humility to accept that there's always more to know, the wisdom to recognize expertise regardless of where it comes from. You would have liked Lindbergh, Dad. You would have understood immediately what he was doing and why it mattered, would have seen past his civilian status and his fame to the core of what he was teaching, that machines are partners, that knowledge comes from attention and experimentation, that the best solutions sometimes contradict conventional wisdom. When I come home, and I will come home, Dad, I'm going to survive this war through a combination of skill and luck, and the fuel efficiency that lets me make it back to base instead of ditching in the ocean. When I come home, I want to work with you again in that hangar. Want to rebuild engines and teach flight students and apply everything I've learned out here to peaceful aviation. Want to tell you stories about flying the P-38, about learning from Lindbergh, about the missions we flew and the men we lost and the lessons we learned the hard way. Want to show you that your son finally understands what you were trying to teach him all those years ago in Spokane. The war isn't over, Dad. Japan is retreating, but fighting hard, making us pay for every mile of ocean and every island we recapture. And there are months or maybe years of combat still ahead before this thing finally ends. I'll keep flying, keep fighting, keep using Lindbergh's technique to extend my range and bring myself and my brothers home safely. Keep learning, keep adapting, keep applying the lessons of listening and humility and continuous improvement that both you and Lindbergh have taught me. And I'll keep writing, keep sending letters home to tell you I'm alive, and thinking about you and looking forward to the day when I can take off this uniform and return to civilian aviation, to the kind of flying that's about joy and freedom and teaching instead of killing and surviving and hoping tomorrow isn't the day your luck runs out. Keep the hangar warm for me, Dad. Keep that radio playing Glenn Miller. Keep the coffee pot on and the tools organized the way you like them. Because I'm coming home. And when I do, we're going to rebuild engines together, and I'm going to show you everything I've learned about listening to machines, about trusting your instincts over the manual, about the difference between knowledge and wisdom. The sun's setting over New Guinea now, Dad, painting the sky in colors that would make you reach for your camera if you were here. The P-38s are lined up on the hardstand, their twin booms silhouetted against the orange and gold. Ground crews performing maintenance that will keep them flying tomorrow and the day after, and however many days it takes until this war finally ends. And I'm sitting here in the shade of Silver Promise's wing, writing this letter and thinking about that hangar in Spokane and the lessons you taught me, and how everything comes full circle if you live long enough to see it. Lindbergh is out there somewhere, probably flying another mission or analyzing more data or teaching another group of pilots how to get more range from their aircraft. He's a quiet hero, Dad, the kind who doesn't seek recognition or glory, who just does what needs to be done because he has knowledge that can save lives, and he considers it his duty to share that knowledge. You would recognize that attitude because you have it too, that sense of responsibility that comes from expertise, that understanding that knowledge is meant to be shared, not hoarded, that the true measure of a man isn't what he knows, but what he does with what he knows. I promise you, Dad, that I'll bring those lessons home with me. We'll teach them to flight students and share them with other pilots and make sure that Lindbergh's innovation doesn't die with this war, but continues forward, continues to shape how we fly and how we understand our aircraft and how we approach the partnership between man and machine. That's the least I can do to honor what he's taught us, what you taught me, what all the pilots who didn't make it home would want us to remember, that aviation is always evolving, always improving, always demanding that we listen and learn and adapt. I understand now, Dad, what you meant all those years ago in the hangar. Understand it in my bones and my blood and my hands that move across controls without conscious thought, that know when an engine is running right and when something's off, that can hear the difference between a healthy motor and one that's about to fail. Understand that listening isn't passive but active, isn't just hearing but interpreting, isn't about accepting what you're told, but questioning and testing and refining your understanding until it matches reality instead of theory. Lindbergh gave me that final piece of understanding, showed me what true expertise looks like when it's applied with humility and precision and absolute commitment to saving lives. He didn't come to the Pacific to prove himself or earn glory, or show us how much smarter he was than military pilots. He came because he had knowledge that could help, because pilots were dying unnecessarily, because he couldn't stand by and let men die when he knew how to save them. That's courage of a different kind than combat courage, Dad. The courage to challenge authority, to prove conventional wisdom wrong, to persist in the face of skepticism and doubt until the evidence becomes undeniable. And I'm grateful, Dad, more grateful than I can express in this letter or probably any letter. Grateful for your teaching that prepared me to understand what Lindbergh was showing us. Grateful for your example that showed me how to approach machines with respect and attention. Grateful for your faith in me that gave me confidence to pursue aviation even when it seemed impossible. Grateful for every hour we spent in that hangar learning lessons that have kept me alive in ways neither of us could have predicted. I'm grateful for Lindbergh too. Grateful that he cared enough to come to a combat zone when he could have stayed safe at home. Grateful that he persisted in teaching us despite our initial skepticism. Grateful that he trusted us with knowledge that has transformed how we fight this war. Every pilot who makes it home using his technique, every bomber crew that completes their mission with full escort, every Japanese target that gets hit because we can now reach it, all of that is Lindbergh's legacy. All of that flows from his willingness to share what he knew and his patience in proving it worked. I'm going to survive this war, Dad. I'm going to use every skill you taught me, every lesson Lindbergh shared, every bit of luck and judgment and careful flying to make it through however many more missions lie between now and victory. I'm going to climb into Silver Promise every morning and fly her with the respect she deserves, listen to her engines and trust what they tell me, manage my fuel with precision and my tactics with wisdom. And I'm going to bring her home every evening until the day comes when we fly that last mission and the war is finally over. And then I'm going to come home to you, Dad. Going to step off the train in Spokane and see you waiting on the platform, probably wearing that same leather jacket from the Great War, probably with grease still on your hands from whatever project you're working on in the hangar. Going to shake your hand, because we're men, and men don't hug, though maybe after what I've been through we could make an exception, and tell you in person all the things this letter can't quite capture. All the fear and triumph and growth and understanding that have transformed me from your son into a man you'd recognize as your equal. Going to work beside you in that hangar again. Going to rebuild engines and teach flight students and share everything I've learned about the P-38 lightning and fuel management and what Charles Lindbergh taught us about listening to machines. Going to tell you stories about the missions I flew and the men I knew and the close calls that should have killed me but didn't. And you'll understand them in ways nobody else could because you've been there. You've done your own war. You know what it costs to survive and what you carry home when the fighting's done. And maybe, Dad, maybe we'll take one of those old planes we rebuild and we'll fly it together, you in the front seat and me in the back, and we'll climb up to where the air is thin and cold, and the world below looks peaceful and perfect, and we'll just fly for the pure joy of it, for the freedom and beauty and wonder that made us love aviation in the first place, before wars turned flying into fighting and machines into weapons. Maybe we'll find that joy again, recover it from underneath all the military necessity and combat stress and death we've seen. Maybe aviation can be innocent again, the way it was when I was young and you were teaching me and everything seemed possible. Tomorrow I fly again, Dad. Another mission, another chance to put Lindbergh's technique to use, another test of skill and luck, and whether I've learned enough to survive another day. The mechanics are finishing up on Silver Promise now. I can hear Ramos working on the port engine, probably replacing spark plugs or adjusting fuel mixture, or performing one of the 100 maintenance tasks that keep these aircraft flying. The other pilots are in their tents writing letters home or trying to sleep despite the heat and humidity and knowledge of what tomorrow brings. And I'm sitting here in the last light of evening, finishing this letter, trying to find words adequate to express what I need you to know. I love you, Dad. Never said it much when I was growing up. We're not that kind of family. Not the kind that talks about feelings or expresses emotions directly. But I'm saying it now because combat teaches you that tomorrow isn't guaranteed, and the men you love might die before you get another chance to tell them what they mean to you. I love you for everything you taught me, for the patience you showed when I was learning, for the faith you had that I could become a pilot even when I doubted myself, for the example you set of how to be a man of skill and integrity and quiet competence. Thank you for the hanger and the lessons and the propeller pin I'm wearing over my heart. Thank you for showing me how to listen to engines, how to respect machines, how to question assumptions and test alternatives, and never accept that something's impossible just because you've never seen it done. Those lessons have kept me alive, Dad, kept me flying, kept me bringing my brothers home safely, and they'll keep serving me tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that until this war ends, and I can finally come home and show you what your son became. Keep the faith, Dad. Keep believing I'll make it home. Keep that hangar ready, and that coffee pot warm and those tools organized the way you like them. Because I'm coming back, bringing with me everything I've learned and everything I've become, and we're going to fly together again, in a world at peace, where the only battles are against gravity and weather, and our own limitations. Your son, who finally understands your engines. Bobby Lee to JG, Robert L. 475th Fighter Group. Somewhere over the Pacific, September 12th, 1944. The impossible became possible because one man refused to accept limits, because a civilian taught military pilots that innovation matters more than doctrine, because someone listened to what engines were really saying instead of just following the manual. Lindbergh gave us 30% more range, but he gave us something more important too. Proof that the best solutions sometimes come from unexpected sources, that expertise transcends rank and uniform, that real knowledge is always worth sharing regardless of where it comes from or who's doing the teaching. That's a lesson that'll outlive this war, Dad. A lesson I'll carry forward and share and make sure doesn't get lost in whatever comes after victory. The sky taught me to listen. You taught me what to listen for. Lindbergh taught me how to hear. Together, those lessons make a pilot who can survive and thrive and bring others home safely. That's what I'm going to keep doing, mission after mission, day after day, until this war is finally over and I can come home and show you what we learned together. Robert survived the war, flying his final combat mission in August of 1945, just days after atomic bombs forced Japan's surrender. He returned to Spokane in October of that year, stepped off the train to find his father waiting exactly where he'd imagined, wearing that ancient leather jacket with grease still on his hands. They shook hands, held the grip longer than necessary, and in that moment communicated everything that words couldn't capture about pride and relief, and the transformation that combat creates in young men. The hangar was still there, still drafty and cold in winter, still smelling of oil and metal and honest labor. Robert and his father reopened their flight instruction business, teaching returning veterans and eager civilians how to fly, sharing not just the mechanics of aviation, but the philosophy, listening to engines, respecting machines, questioning assumptions, never accepting that something's impossible without testing it first. Robert would tell his students about Lindbergh's technique, about the civilian consultant who'd changed how an entire theater fought its war, about the importance of staying curious and humble and open to learning from unexpected sources. Charles Lindbergh's fuel management technique became standard doctrine across the military, incorporated into training manuals and operational procedures, saving countless gallons of fuel and extending the range of every P-38 Lightning that flew for the remainder of the war and beyond. The official recognition came slowly. The military was reluctant to acknowledge that a civilian had solved a problem career officers hadn't seen. But the pilots knew, and that knowledge spread through the community, became part of aviation lore, became one of those stories that gets told to illustrate that innovation comes from thinking differently. Robert never forgot Lieutenant James K. and the pilot who'd died of fuel exhaustion weeks before Lindbergh's arrival, who ditched 30 miles from base with empty tanks and disappeared into the Pacific. At every memorial service, at every reunion, Robert would mention James and the others who died before the impossible became possible, would remind people that every innovation comes too late for someone, that the cost of not questioning assumptions is measured in lives lost needlessly. We owe it to them, he'd say, to keep learning, keep improving, keep refusing to accept that this is the best we can do. In 1953, Robert hung a brass plaque in his hangar, mounted it right next to the propeller pin his father had given him decades before. The plaque read, RPM 1600, the day we learned to listen. Students would ask what it meant, and Robert would tell them about Lindbergh and the P-38 and the civilian who'd taught military pilots that manuals aren't gospel, that conventional wisdom isn't always wise, that true expertise means knowing when to question authority. Aviation is always evolving, he'd tell them. The day you stop learning is the day you become dangerous. Listen to your engines. Question your assumptions. Never believe something's impossible just because you've never seen it done. His father, William, died in 1962, passing quietly in his sleep at age 70, and at the funeral Robert stood and spoke about lessons learned in a drafty hangar, about a father who'd taught his son to listen before teaching him to fly, about how everything Robert had survived and achieved traced back to those cold mornings in Spokane learning the language of engines. He gave me more than skills, Robert said. He gave me the mindset to survive, the curiosity to keep learning, the humility to accept teaching regardless of its source. Every pilot I've trained, every life I've saved through careful instruction, every improvement I've made to how we fly, all of that started with my father showing me that machines are partners, not tools, and that real knowledge comes from paying attention. Robert flew until he was 78 years old, finally hanging up his wings in 1996, after 6 decades of aviation and thousands of hours of flight time. He died in 2001 at age 83, surrounded by family and former students who'd gone on to become pilots and instructors themselves, carrying forward the lessons he'd taught them. At his funeral, elderly men showed up wearing P-38 squadron patches, veterans of the Pacific War who'd flown with Satan's angels and learned Lindbergh's technique and survived to tell about it. They placed a model P-38 Lightning in his coffin, painted in the colors of Silver Promise, a tribute to the aircraft that had carried him through the war and the lessons that had kept him alive. Charles Lindbergh's legacy in World War II extends beyond his fuel management technique. He flew over 50 combat missions as a civilian consultant, shot down at least 1 Japanese aircraft, pushed the limits of what was possible with existing technology, and demonstrated that expertise doesn't require uniform or rank, just knowledge and courage and willingness to share what you know. Military historians credit his contributions with extending the P-38's range by up to 31%, enabling missions that would have been impossible otherwise, potentially saving hundreds of pilots who would have died from fuel exhaustion. But the deeper legacy, the one Robert carried forward through 6 decades of teaching, was about mindset rather than technique. Lindbergh proved that questioning assumptions saves lives, that innovation comes from thinking differently, that the best answers sometimes come from outside the system, that true expertise means staying humble and curious and open to learning, regardless of where that learning comes from. Those lessons transcended aviation, applied to any field where lives depend on getting things right, where complacency kills and continuous improvement matters more than maintaining tradition. If this letter moved you, if Lindbergh's ingenuity and Robert's courage deserve to be remembered, subscribe to this channel and leave your like. Every subscription helps us preserve voices like theirs, voices that remind us that courage can be quiet, that innovation matters as much as bravery, that the best victories sometimes come from knowledge rather than weapons. There are thousands more stories untold. Men like Lieutenant James K., who died before help arrived. Civilians like Lindbergh, who contributed to victory without wearing uniforms. Fathers like William, who taught their sons the foundations that kept them alive. Mechanics like Ramos, who kept aircraft flying through shortages and neglect. Your support keeps their memory alive. Your subscription ensures the next generation understands that wars are won through innovation as much as combat, through questioning as much as following orders, through listening as much as fighting. Subscribe. Leave your like, share this story, and if your family ever had someone who flew or fixed planes, or who solved impossible problems through knowledge and persistence, write their name in the comments. Let's honor them together. The impossible became possible on a Pacific airfield in 1944, when a civilian taught military pilots to listen to their engines differently, to question their training, to accept that the manual might be wrong. That moment changed how an entire war was fought, saved lives that would have been lost, created opportunities that didn't exist before, and it proved something fundamental about human ingenuity and the power of knowledge freely shared. That the best solutions often come from unexpected sources, that expertise transcends rank and institution, that real courage sometimes means challenging authority with evidence and patience until truth prevails. Robert L. William L. James K. Charles Lindbergh. Crew Chief Ramos. Lieutenant Tex M. Captain H.D. Their names deserve to be spoken. Their contributions deserve to be remembered. Their legacy, innovation through questioning, survival through knowledge, improvement through humility, deserves to inspire future generations facing their own impossible problems. Their voices, our mission, over and out.